Good afternoon, one and all. On behalf of Indian Dietetic Association Bangalore chapter, I welcome all the participants, the students, and the live members and the associate members who have logged in for the session. And the speaker for today's session, Dr. Pratibha Dwarkanath. As we all are aware, the first week of September was celebrated as National Nutrition Week, which was later on declared to be National Nutrition Month by our beloved Prime Minister, Mr. Narendra Modi ji, in the year 2018. And he named it as Poshan Maha under the Poshan Abhiyan. And the objective of Poshan Maha is to ensure community mobilization and encourage people to participate in addressing malnutrition among young children and women to ensure health and nutrition for everyone. And malnutrition includes, undernutrition, that is wasting, stunting, underweight, inadequate vitamin and mineral status, and also obesity and overweight. As per WHO, globally in 2020, they have given the statistics that 149 million children under the age of 5 years were estimated to be stunted, and around 45 million were to be estimated to be wasted, and around 38.9 million to be overweight or obese. So around 45% of the death among children which under the age of 5 years was linked to undernutrition. These mostly occur in the low and middle income group categories. At the same time, in the same countries, around there were the numbers of overweight and obese children were increasing also. And child undernutrition remains very high in India. Despite a lot of improvements and despite a lot of measures, Indian children continue to face this burden of malnutrition and undernutrition. So therefore, today, to address this issue, to address the root cause of this issue, we have our speaker, Dr. Pratibha Dwarkanath, who will be focusing more on, how maternal nutrition can help, giving us healthy infants in future. So the topic is optimal maternal nutrition, key to healthy infants. So I request Ms. Sangeeta Narayan Swami to introduce our speaker for today.
Thank you, Sandhya. This is Sangeeta. It's an absolute pleasure to be welcoming our speaker, Dr. Pratibha, today. Dr. Pratibha Dwarkanath is an associate professor at the Division of Nutrition, St. John's Research Institute, Bangalore. Sandhya, will you be sharing her slides?
Yes. Just a second.
I'll just wait for, yeah.
Sure. You just start sharing it.
Sure, Sandhya. No problem. I'll just,
you just start reading.
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Sandhya. Dr. Pratibha Dwarkanath is an associate professor at the Division of Nutrition, St. John's Research Institute, Bangalore, India. Her key research areas are first 1,000 days of life, particularly why Indian babies are born small, through observational, interventional, physiological, and molecular approaches in the field of maternal and child health. She has around 60 publications in national and international peer-reviewed journals and has also contributed to a chapter in the book L-arginine production during pregnancy. And she's a recognized PhD supervisor in food science and nutrition, University of Mysore, and also in Manipal Academy of Higher Education. She's a member of various bodies and expert committees, human, developmental, and disease biology, addressing the health needs of women and children. I think this is an Indo-UK collaboration. Maternal and Child Health Program, DBT India. Nutrition Society of India, Healthy Birth, Growth and Development Knowledge Integration India Extension. This is the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. The Young Scientist Award, that is the NSI Prize Ramanathan Award, during many NSI conferences, 2007, 2009, 2011, 12, 15, and 17. She is doing collaborative studies with Harvard School of Public Health, King's funding from the Melinda and Bill Gates Foundation, Medical Research Council of UK, Grand Challenges Canada, NIH DBT India. Her key studies has been demonstrating non-inferiority of a lower dose calcium supplementation during pregnancy to reduce preeclampsia and neonatal outcomes. Oral vitamin D supplementation as a safe, affordable treatment for profound vitamin D deficiency in pregnancy. Distinguishing features of immune signatures of BCG vaccination in infants and revaccination in adolescents in Bangalore, India. Proof of concept of a culturally appropriate iron-fortified biscuit to reduce maternal and perinatal anemia. Her research work, she has contributed to news and media. To name a few, tasty iron biscuits for India women to take on anemia in the New Indian Express and the Hindu. A study that finds lack of vitamin B12 may trigger low birth weight, and iron overdose in non-anemic women can affect pregnancy in the Bangalore Mirror. It was an absolute pleasure to read your CV, Dr. Pratibha. We welcome you, and I think the stage is all yours.
Dr. Pratibha, I'll stop sharing. You can share your slides.
Thank you so much. Is my slide visible?
Yes, we are able to.
Yes.
Thank you very much for such a kind.
Can I request all the participants to please mute their microphones? Can we all mute our microphones, please? Yes, Dr. Pratibha.
Thanks, Ms. Sangeeta, for such a wonderful introduction. And it means a lot, especially during the COVID pandemic. We all are trying our best to ensure that the maternal and child health is the key, and we're able to meet it. I thank the IDA for giving this opportunity to showcase some work and to also talk about the importance of maternal nutrition and how it leads to, if not inadequacy, how it leads to adverse birth outcomes, and how we can ensure that healthy babies are born. I thank Dr. Sandhya for giving this platform now, speaking to me about work. All the panelists here, the participants. I do see some students, and thank you very much for joining. So should I begin? Optimal maternal nutrition, key to healthy infants. I will plan my presentation such that a couple of points are taken into account. And while the sky is the limit, I cannot talk on everything, but the first 1,000 days of life. So briefly introducing the importance of first 1,000 days, what it means. Number two, celebrating the nutrition month, it is very much important to talk about maternal diet, which is a determinant of an adverse birth outcome. So I'll touch base on that. While pregnancy plays a very important role to also ensure that the infant growth is for the optimal. And of course, I'll substantiate all that I speak today with some findings, some evidences from the work that has been done here at St. John's. So the work from my lab, from my team will also be shown in intervals wherever I have something to talk about the findings. So this is called the first 1,000 days, which includes 270 days of the pregnancy and 365 days of the first year and the second year of birthday. Why do we talk about this? Because growth from conception to 2 years represents a critical window of opportunity to shape healthier and more prosperous futures. We also know that the right nutrition during pregnancy has a profound impact on a child. We're talking about better future, bright futures, which means that we're indicating towards a healthy adults. So this is a slide which is based on Doha, developmental origins of health and adult disease. That the left side of the panel, you see a pregnant mom. So any insult, any deficiency, any adverse thing that happens at this level can have profound impact, not only on the growing fetus, on the children, as well as in young adult and later in life, even at the geriatric level. And that is why these 1,000 days of life play a very crucial role in development of an adult or of a human being. We all know, and this is a cycle which I think most of the students would have gone through during their school days, during the graduates and postgraduates. It talks about a poor nutrition through the life cycle, which indicates that if a baby girl is born low birth weight, she tends to have a stunted childhood if doesn't get adequate, continues to be a stunted adolescent, and further also may have a pregnancy. We start with low BMI, underweight mother, a low weight gain, and eventually may give rise to a low birth weight gain. And that is what we keep talking about, a poor nutrition throughout the life cycle. And it means a lot for us because 30% of our babies are born low birth weight. Almost 10 to 12% of the babies are born preterm. And isn't this a public health priority? Apart from this, the babies also face a dual burden. The risk of various morbidities, not only immediately at birth, but later in life also. And that is where the concept of FOHAD came in, fetal origin of health and adult disease. While we talk about the baby, those 9 months that the mother is carrying the baby, if there's a deficiency of a nutrient, if there is an insult in any of the parameters that leads to an adverse birth outcome, come with a package, which means that any morbidity of that the mother faces could be anemia, could be hypertension during pregnancy, or diabetes or infection, not only affects the mother, but also has and 2-time problems on the baby as well. And why are we talking of so much of a concern? Because routine antenatal care is practiced in every hospital. The ANC, what we call, mandates that every pregnant mom from the time of conception gets a routine care, gets a clinical examination, gets her investigations done at least 4 times in those 9 months of pregnancy. There is also a concern on the ultrasound that is being done. It is mandated to have 3 ultrasounds, 1 in each trimester, so that we know that the baby is growing well. While having known all these kind of support programs being there in India, we still have adverse birth outcome change. And what is that factor that is modifiable? And here we come talking about nutrition. So these small things changes, if were done at home level, at the community level, at an individual level, will certainly have value to a better future. So let me walk you through if there is any deficiency in either of the trimesters, what kind of information it could lead to. So now look at this column, which talks about trimesters It will talk about responses to fetal undernutrition and how that would affect either the birth weight at birth, maybe the baby body parameters or the proportions at birth, at 1 year, which is a very important milestone, and also in adult life. Not taking too much of time, an insult in the first trimester or a deficiency could downregulate the growth. That is, the formation or organogenesis at the time of the developmental aspect may have reduced birth weight, may indicate a proportionally small baby, and further on have reduced weight gain if it's not able to meet the may not be able to catch up with the growth, and may have other problems like non-communicable diseases. Similar kind of stuff could happen if it is in the second trimester, because that is where the fetal-placental relationship is well established. This may lead to insulin resistance or deficiency, and again we have a whole lot of problems ranging from reduced birth weight onwards and complicating it to non-communicable diseases such as hypertension, diabetes, cardiac problems, and coronary heart disease. While we talk about the third trimester, the important part of the body, the brain, is being formed. It could also be sustained in case, but at the expense of a trunk effect, which means that the baby may be born small for gestation. It could be compromised. There could be other factors such as growth hormone resistance and many more. So rather than talking about only negativity, what is important for us to take home message is that a good nutrition, a balanced diet during pregnancy can avoid a lot of problems what we see in adult life. So let's quickly talk about why do we still talk at the crucial period, because it has a profound implication on the mother in those 9 months itself. It also has an impact on a long-term effect for the mother and as well as the baby in terms of growth and developmental aspect. And that is where we are focusing our first 1,000 days of life. Therefore, the global targets put forward for 2025 to improve maternal, infant, and young child nutrition, that is the WHO goals, are very important. You know that stunting has been on the rise. So the plan is to decrease stunting in under 5 by at least 40%. NFHS 3-4 has also shown anemia in women of reproductive age to be almost 50 or 53%. Isn't that high? Despite of all the iron folic acid programs of supplementation being implemented. So the plan is to decrease them. I spoke about 1 in 3 baby is born low birth weight, which means 30%. So would like to decrease that as well so we can have a better future. Lot of myths about exclusive breastfeeding. People really don't know the definition and they do not even continue until 6 months. It is very essential because that is the main source of nutrient to the growing baby. Why we talk about childhood wasting, and as Dr. Sandhya rightly said, that almost 40.3% or 43% of our infants are now going onto the other side of the malnutrition, the other spectrum, is obesity and overweight. And I would give the credit to the unfortunate COVID scenario where people are all restrained to refrain to homes. So there's a lot of inactivity that will build up. So we should make an additional effort to ensure that childhood overweight and obesity is also reduced. There has been a modification in the guidelines. All know that ICMR NIH Dietary Recommendations 2020 have been amended, and with a cause, with a purpose, to ensure that we follow something called estimated average requirements for evaluating population nutrient intake. So what we were using previously was the RDA. RDA was something which we talk about in nutrients so far in general. But it is important at this point of time to understand that when you look at the bell-shaped curve, we should not be flattening the curve to the right-hand side either, which means that when you look at the birth weights, although we make an effort to ensure that the low birth weights are tackled, we are pushing the whole spectrum of the population into a right-side corner, which adds on to the overweight, obesity, and many more. So India was spoken as undernourished population, but now you can see that every other person, 1 in 5, is being categorized as obese or overweight. Now, when we talk about diet, there are multiple methods of assessing the diet. It comes up with what method is used and what is the purpose of it. So to briefly tell you, there are 24-hour diet record, food consumption record, dietary records, or food diaries called, diet history, or a food frequency questionnaire. Each method comes with its own strength and limitations. And what is important for us to focus at this point of time is that who is your population? Are you having this information for a clinical purposes, for therapeutic purposes, or first just to understand the pattern of a particular person's diet? So based on that, if you were to ask me that I get a pregnant mom in the second trimester, maybe 24 weeks of gestation with high blood sugars, and I'm told to look at her diet intake, the first thing that will come to my mind is to put my finger on to a method called food frequency questionnaire and get an idea of her diet pattern for the last 3 months, which would give me some indication on her way of eating, which will also be supported with other blood parameters. So this is how, and I know that this forum is all about the people who are following clinical nutritionists, they are dietitians, and this is something which they do very regularly in their clinics. Moving forward, this is a table I just wanted to bring it up to talk to you that the nutrient requirements for pregnant moms and for lactating is all given. We will have to also take this with a pinch of salt, understand how the woman starts her body weight and ensure her activity, be physical activity and her energy expenditure. And that will give us a little holistic approach to understanding whether any recommendation to her or an alteration in her diet should be targeted or should be on a common area. So now that we're talking about maternal diet, and we know that it's a modifiable factor, it could act as a single nutrient or a bunch of nutrients to make it as a food group. We know that ANC supplementation programs talk about iron, folic acid, calcium, all these are individual nutrients. So they do have an effect on the baby or on the birth outcome. But there are many nutrients, they are not spoken in isolation, but with a collaborative of other nutrients may have a profound impact. And very simple, it is a translation of this nutrient intake into a food group for a community or a layman person. So for example, if I were to tell somebody, please have vitamin B12, especially a farmer, and say that, look, your B12, you're low in B12, you're anemic, it could be about pernicious anemia. Will that help me? Or if I were to tell her that you have a deficiency, you may have to bring it up by using some food groups like milk and milk products. So now as a forum of panelists who are students, who are dietitians, or who do counseling, then it becomes more easy for us to translate our knowledge scientifically onto a forum that is for the layman. So to bring it to your point that I will be discussing one of the nutrients, taking the example as an independent nutrient working in isolation, and also its role when it comes in together as a food group, which has an effect on maternal and birth outcomes. So let's take an example of what I have studied so far with regards to vitamin B12 during pregnancy and birth weight. These 3 graphs represent trimester 1, 2, and 3. The mothers who had low vitamin B12 intake is through diet, correlated positively with their status. What is B12 status? It is the blood biomarker that you see in bloods when you estimate it. It properly correlated. We also saw that the mothers who had low vitamin B12 status, that had blood biomarkers low, had babies also with low vitamin B12 status. How did this assess? It was assessed by the cord blood. Cord blood at the time of delivery represents the blood, if it is cut at the fetal side, will represent the fetal statuses. So now you know that if you have low intake, it can be seen in your bloods. If you have low blood circulating B12s, there's a chance that the baby will also have low vitamin B12. The most striking thing observed was the woman who had low vitamin B12 had a higher risk of having an IUGR baby. IUGR baby is intrauterine growth restricted baby, which means that the baby has grown small for its gestational age at birth. So what does this indicate? I'm sure there will be people pondering around thinking that how is this related and what could be the premise of having this kind of a result? And well, we would like to know whether it has a direct role in determining birth outcome, that is an independent nutrient, or it has an other angle to this association. What could that be? The source of B12. Now tell me, almost 50% or 40 to 50% of our Indians are vegetarian diet followers. So how would they get vitamin B12 when the vitamin B12 is mostly in animal product? So the question arises, is vitamin B12 related to any other nutrient? Maybe through folic acid or any other B vitamins? Is vitamin B12 a biomarker for protein? So is it linked to something like milk, which is a holistic so-called diet? Or is it important in methylation cycle, well-known methylation cycle, where B12 is a cofactor? So there are multiple questions that arise over here, and I would like to get a blend of scientific information and also for a lay person as to understand what were the findings when we started looking at these things independently. So we looked at milk and milk proteins, those who consumed during pregnancy, and what was their effect at birth weight. So we saw that the women who had higher intakes of milk had better birth weights. Similarly, second trimester had better birth weights. And similar thing was also translated when we looked at milk protein in terms of IUGR. Those who had enough milk protein had higher risk of having an adverse outcome of small for gestational age. So this, and all this is taken into account all the other multiple factors that can also lead to birth weight, adverse birth outcomes, such as low birth weight. So here the concern again comes in, wow, if these things are there, we have seen that B12 independently has an effect. We have seen that as a food group also has an effect. Then if we were to link the whole story through the milk protein through diet was linked to something, and look at this carefully, it's called GWG, it's called a gestational weight gain. That was linked to birth weight. And again, milk protein was independently linked to birth. While when you look at B12, this is where it was. The diet, the B12 through diet did not have a link to gestational weight gain, but the following thing. So here the question is that if you have enough food during pregnancy, whether you are a low BMI mother, that is BMI is body mass index, if you're underweight, still you can make up for the required nutrients to give rise to a healthy baby. So the concept over here was whether B12 worked in isolation, whether it worked with the group, or it is important in a methionine cycle, as I rightly pointed you some time ago, that it is a very important nutrient, acts as a cofactor, and has not only role in the methylation, but many more functions to play. Hence, let's move on a little bit more to look at what is gestational weight gain. Weight gain during pregnancy is into two parts, maternal and fetal. However, in the 40 weeks of gestation, you can see that this maternal weight gain has an important premises so that the fetus gets that enough weight, the placenta is formed, the amniotic fluid is increasing, the extracellular fluid is there, and many other tissues and fat stores, especially uterus and breast and many more. So on an average, for a 40-week gestation of pregnancy, and a mother who weighs around 10 to 12 kilos of weight gain during pregnancy had a sensitive breakup of all the weights. And that is why it becomes even more important that you don't want to compromise on any of the factors, but ensure that the baby is fine in terms of the birth outcome. So let me give you an example. Can you see these two ladies? Apparently, they are both pregnant with different BMIs. So one is obese and one is low BMI. So what would happen if the low BMI mother is pregnant? Will she be able to have enough energy and protein stores to the theory what we were looking at earlier? So will she be able to give rise to a healthy baby? Will she have enough stores to ensure that the fetal growth is met of the developing fetuses? And the reason why I'm asking this question is that generally, when a baby gets energy for growth, it is with two mechanisms. Gluconeogenesis. Neogenesis is formation of new glucose, and glycogenolysis. Lysis breakdown. Glycogen stores are broken. So this concept I will try to explain. It's a novel model. So far, we have been using some terms some measurements which are done during our traditional schooling and things like that, I'll introduce a new factor called the isotope, stable isotope method. So what are isotopes? Isotopes of an element have the same number of protons in the nucleus, but different atomic mass. So can you see one H? What we drink as water has one H. It's called H2O. One additional neutron makes two H2O. It is double labeled water. And believe me, we all have that stable isotope with us. So in this man, if you see, what you have seen in pink is what is existing in you. But the yellow ones are the stable isotopes. So everybody comes up with this. It's a habitual available in you. Hello? Yeah. So what we assume is that during this technique, we divide the body into two parts, divided into fat and non-fat. And as you know, the non-fat will have three more components, minerals, proteins, and water to make it to fat-free mass. So now you have fat and you have fat-free mass, and then you divide the whole system to ensure that you get three more parameters. From your body fat, you can calculate your person fat, your fat-free mass, and fat mass. And this is a novel thing because you don't have to draw blood sample. They're not invasive. You don't have to chase a person for days together. But of course, you can do this in a community setting as well as the clinical aspect. The principle, what it takes is very simple. If you look at this man at baseline, you can see those red dots, which are the stable isotopes, which is already there with us. And the normal blue dots are what you have. For example, you're drinking water. This is hydrogen, normal hydrogen that you have. The red dots are the heavy ones. So that is why it is called a deuterium. Now, when you drink a set dose, if I give X quantity of D2O, it will start dissolving in the person. So after dose, there will be an equilibrium in the body. So it gets dissolved in all the water pool, right? So this is your body pool. I'm giving a set dose of D2O and it gets mixed in this and comes to an equilibrium state. At equilibrium, if I'm going to sample any of your fluid, could be saliva, could be urine, could be blood, I would be able to understand what is your body water pool. And that is how you understand that without going through a detailed procedure, just by giving a stable isotope can accumulate and understand the body composition. Now going back to what we spoke about, two mothers who started their pregnancy, one with low BMI and one with normal BMI. Can you see this mother? She's going to give energy to her growing fetuses. And we assume now the fetal demands are met only by the maternal supply of glucose. So she's one who's giving the glucose for the energy and the growth. Now imagine this mother who's in fasted state or is low BMI, and assuming that the glucose met is only by those two mechanisms that I spoke to you, gluconeogenesis and glycogenolysis. And we know that the formation of new cells is dependent on something. So something has to break down, right? So that's a protein that breaks down. That's called an endogenous protein. So while all these things are happening in your body, if your protein stores are not enough, the assumption is that the low BMI mother will not be able to give enough supply to the baby. And that supply is accounted as glucose oxidation. And the baby may not be able to grow enough to the gestational age. Hence, we feel that to meet this requirement, we need to have more food. But that concept of more food, eating for two people, is all not required. I will explain you how the transfer of a nutrient from the mother to the baby takes place through a very simple thing of giving a glucose. Imagine I'm going to give a glucose. Generally, glucose is made up of 6 carbons, and these carbons have 12 atoms. I'm going to label them to make it to 13, which is stable, and I'm giving to them. The moment I give this glucose, it gets diluted in your pool, and it's given out as glucose oxidation by the mother and the baby. Now, what we are going to look at is understand how the mechanism of gluconeogenesis and glycogenesis takes place when this 13C glucose is given. And it's a very simple calculation which talks about the fate of that glucose that was given to the mother. Hence, when we looked at the mothers who were low BMI versus normal BMI, the surprising note was that the glucose oxidation was higher in these mothers who are low BMI, indicating that they could transfer enough energy to the growing fetus. And that was seen because they had diet which was adequate during pregnancy, and the gestational weight was also high as compared to normal BMI. The concept is that first 1,000 days plays an important role. During pregnancy, eating adequate and healthy food is the key for a successful pregnancy. While we talk about pregnancy, let's look forward one step to look at what is infancy. The first 2 years of life also important, and then looking forward for what happens during breastfeeding. There's several unanswered questions. So, what is the definition of exclusive breastfeeding? There's still a lot of people, they have in the myth of giving water, sugar syrup, honey, etc., and do claim this exclusive breastfeeding, which is not correct. Is the baby getting adequate nutrition during breastfeeding or through breast milk? Is another question that each mother feels. She would say that, oh, I'm feeding my baby, but still I'm not satisfied. Are we following standard practices? So there are several questions that take into account to understand how a baby is growing and whether it is growing adequately. So again, we all know that the breast milk is a complete nutrition for a growing fetus. WHO has come up with strict guidelines talking about initiation of breast milk as early as possible within 1 hour of birth. Excellent. Continue breastfeeding for at least 6 months exclusively, if not at least 4 months. Start the complementary feeding only after 6 months, and then, if possible, continue breastfeeding along with complementary or weaning foods until 2 years. So while we know all this, there are a lot of advantages of breastfeeding, not only to the mother, but also to the baby. So in brief, there are a lot of things that the mother is also being protected through. And as I don't go into detail, I want to list out a whole range of morbidities that can be reduced. These morbidities for the infants can be reduced by almost 50 to 72% with the varying degrees of problems if the duration of breastfeeding is continued. So this table will give you in a snapshot tell you that not only from the point of view of having immediate hospitalization or infections or things like that, we could also go to non-communicable diseases for protection. While we talk about all these things, one aspect many of us do not touch base, that is source, or it could be about the brain development. So those babies who are exclusive breastfed for a longer time do have intelligence scores higher. So that is something that even mothers should take into account. We spoke about morbidity, we spoke about intelligence. One thing is about the mortality. We can't let go of that because the infant mortality rate is still on a higher side. So we tend to decrease that. And what we have observed, these are the 2 slides. Look at the left-hand slide where you have relative risk of early initiation versus overall late initiation. So the relative risk of children dying if they were to initiate breastfeeding early is less as compared to those who had late initiation or never breastfed. Similar kind of a thing you have on the right-hand side, taking into account about different causes of mortality, especially with diarrhea as well as pneumonia, and trying to give a grading that how you can restrain or restrict morbidity if through breastfeeding. So exclusive breastfeeding, which was called until 5 months of age in 2015, was seen globally. It was seen that although we expect 100% breastfeeding, only 60% of the babies were exclusive breastfeeding in South Asia. And the graph what you see to the right-hand side is of the data from NFHS 2, 3, 4, all ranging only up to 50 or 55%. The question arises, why are there so much of differences in percentages, not only globally as well as in India? So the concern is, are the methods of estimating breastfeeding correct? Is the lactation performance ever evaluated? And therefore, there are other methods to assess now breast milk intake. So, well, it's a little hard to understand how much of the milk the baby is being consuming, right? And that is why there are other kind of methods which are tedious, but which talks about how best we can assess the breast milk intake. Either by questionnaire base, so you keep asking the mom how many times she fed, how many hours she fed, how long she fed, and many more. You can ask the infant or maternal test weight. Each time the mother feeds the baby, You take the weight of the baby, you take the weight of the mother, and many more. And asking the mother to express the milk completely from either breast, which means that you're taking away a feed or a milk. So just to summarize, these three techniques come up with a lot of difficulties and drawbacks. And again, I would like to point out another novel method to understand breast milk intake or lactation performance using stable isotope. So the three methods that I spoke to have their difficulties within and have a lot of drawbacks. Imagine a mother is breastfeeding, and we as a researcher breathe down her neck every other time to say, I want to weigh you, I want to weigh you. Do you think psychologically the mother will be able to breastfeed her baby well? No. So the concept over here is that these approaches do not reflect habitual infant intakes due to the interference with a lot of issues, psychological or behavioral aspects of lactation, and are not precise and accurate. So again, we're back to square one. And how do we know that the breast milk intake is enough, and what is the lactation performance? So I introduce one more thing to talk about compliance through a stable isotope technique of using stable isotopes. So, see, you answer a baby-friendly hospital, and we saw that only 23% babies are exclusively breastfed at second month. And you know what the word means, dose to mother? Look at the lactation performance in baby, which means that you're complying with all the rules of exclusive breastfeeding. So this is a simple method. You can see that there's a mother sitting here. She has a baby. Now I'm going to give her a set volume of 2H2, that is deuterium, to drink. Now this mother is going to breastfeed her baby. Eventually the baby is going to get this through her breastfeed. The baby is also going to have some external food, and that is what her milk is. So these two, baby and the mother died, will have D2 in their body pool. So the saliva or the blood will be enriched with 2H2 or even the urine. The subsample of urine or saliva over a period of time will help me in understanding how the body composition is by estimating total body water. So it follows a two-compartment model, what I spoke some time ago, fat mass and fat free. So the whole model will give you an array of information, which means that when you do the P parts per million estimation of this D2, the dark line starts declining. That the D2 is getting washed out on a daily basis until 14 days, and it's off her body. At the same time, since the baby is being fed with breast milk, there's an increase in the D2, comes to a plateaued position and then starts declining. So through this model, you'll not only know mother's total body water volume, but also other parameters like baby's total body water volume, how much of the water the mother has taken from outside, the baby how much has taken non-breast fluid, and many more things. So this gives you a robust information about not only the lactation performance, but will also indicate body composition if it is done on the babies as well. So now let's look at what are the methods to estimate the growth. Now this baby, if you were to ask, has a lot of issues. There's several unanswered questions. For example, a low birth weight baby. So there's always a query. Is this low birth weight baby going to have adequate body composition? How would the survival of this baby be? Would this baby catch up with the height and weight in your future? If there are babies with severe acute malnutrition, SAM children, how do they grow? Do they have a different body composition by themselves? And how would your early body composition help in addressing other problems of adult disease such as obesity and chronic disease? So the concern is here, will an obese child tend to be obese in your future? And many more questions. And that is why there are multiple methods to assess body composition. And very common ones used in the clinics otherwise are the anthropometric measures, the total body water stable isotope I have been talking about for the 2 times now, understanding how a nutrient transfer from the mother to the baby can be done using stable isotope, how lactation performance can be done, and of course how a body composition of the baby can be estimated. You have DEXA. DEXA is one of the other methods which is using X-rays. It is generally used for the adult to look at osteoporosis and other soft tissue problems, but it is also can be used for infant body composition. A displacement method, it is very common in a P-POD method. I'll talk about it. And also whole body potassium counting, which is a novel method. In India, only two institutes have it, one at St. John's and one at NIL. And it is so easy and user-friendly that it will count all the potassium cells that you have. It will then translate into a number of equations to give you your three main body composition parameters: fat mass, fat-free mass, and fat percentage. So let's look at anthropometer in brief. We all know this upfront that it has advantages, limitations, quickly it can be done. There are very good accurate scales. But one thing for sure I would like to reiterate about the height, because when you're trying to take the height of the baby, eventually the baby slides to slid down the scale or that machine. And that is why you need two people to accurately measure the length of the infant. Anthropometry of the mother is also done generally to ensure that postnatally also she is doing fine, but for the baby, you need two people to do it. Based on your height and weight, head circumference also, you have various growth charts. The growth charts for girls and boys are there, which will help us in understanding the growth trajectories until 5 years. You have this recommended by IAP for the pediatricians. We also have this to talk about the change in centiles. And that's very important for a pediatrician to know how the baby is growing, whether it is crossing over the centiles. So basically the concept is follow the curve. For example, if you have a baby, maybe let's say weight of for girls between 15th and 50th centile, it's important for us to follow regularly to ensure that she is not falling down her centile, but eventually going ahead in the same centile or trying to cross the centile. The moment the baby is off the centile, there's an alarm to pediatrician that there is some problem and needs intervention. Similar method is for the heights also, and you can see that there are a lot of issues on SAM and MAM children, and SAM is severely acute malnourished, while they are moderate acute malnourished. There are set definitions to identify them, and hence growth charts play a very important role. In continuation to anthropometry, we have something called skin-fold thicknesses. Now, most of the doctors prefer this because the adiposity or the central adiposity is increasing in our children also. And central obesity is not too good because that talks about other non-communicable diseases early in life. And this is based on, so you take a lot of circumferences, there are set formulas to estimate. And again, bottom line is that you tend to understand the body composition, track them down as they grow periodically. Stable isotope methods, I have spoken some time ago, it takes into account two compartment model, and it is easy to administer. It's a non-radioactive, so that's perfectly fine. You don't have to really inject it. It's simple, and biological sample like urine and saliva can be used to determine this. And you can see that this is one of the IAEA guidelines showing a baby being given a D2O to estimate body composition. Well, all this looks good, but believe me, it is very, very difficult to work with babies than adults. So don't think it's very easy to take a saliva sample from a baby or dose a baby, and you can see a different set of expressions. Imagine you are in a site where you're supposed to take saliva sample for baby, and you have this difficult baby just frowning at you, a non-cooperative baby. It takes hours for you to wake this baby up only to take a saliva sample. The other set of babies which you see at the down bottom of the screen is really hard. If there's a baby who's crying with the drooling saliva, who spits on every possible thing or keeps moving his tongue. And imagine these, once you are unsuccessful in giving a dose, you will have to wait to repeat the experiment for next 14 days, because just in case the baby has taken any deuterium inside, allow that time to have the washout period and then take it forward. So every method comes with its advantages, maybe a spike of disadvantage also, or a limitation, I would say rather. DEXA is used generally, but I would not prefer in children. It's not me who is not preferring. It has own ethical limitations. Parents concerned, because I don't think that the site what you see here is very appealing. The positioning, preparing to standardize, so you may need to sedate the child for a little while and things like that. And then you have other set of errors, the motion artifact, which means if the baby is moving, you're not able to record it correctly. It follows the 3-compartment model because it has more information: fat mass, bone mineral mass, and lean soft tissue mass as well. A displacement method is a very common method. It is like you are trying to put the baby into a nice cocoon, oval shaped thing, and trying to understand how much of air is displaced. Follow the 2-compartment model. And again, the whole lot of advantages are there, which comes again with a small disadvantage of understanding at what age you can perform this only. Potassium counter is something that talks about how the total potassium in your body is accounted for. Then the whole lot of equations transfer to total nitrogen, and then you look at all our bone cell mass that we have. So this is how it looks. And when we were testing and standardizing, I did put my son into this, and you can see I'm thanking my son for this, because it was easy for us to do while the experiment or the counting takes a longer time. You don't have to worry if the child cries. You can pick them up, put them back in, and you can start or stop wherever you were the previous time. So there's no worry about the movements and things like that. The restrictions are less, which is time consuming and has a lot of formula in it. I would like to close my discussion today by talking about national nutrition programs. Government of India and Government of Karnataka and other government, of course, have put in a lot of efforts in understanding that there's safe motherhood and there's continuum of care that takes into account to ensure that whatever programs are laid are met by individual and the community level. So with this, I think having healthy nutrition during pregnancy helps in 2 levels. One, for the mother herself, and also for the growing fetuses, that not only has an effect at the time of delivery or at birth, but also continues in the adult life. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Pratibha, for a very dynamic session on how mothers, nutrition is going to, affect the health of the baby. There are a couple of questions that I'm going to take from the chat box. With focus on sports now, post-Olympics, how much maternal nutrition affect an athlete? Can it be overcome through nutrition and physical training later in life?
Yeah, so to some extent, as we said, that the fetal origin of adult diseases play a profound role. An appropriate nutrition during pregnancy always help a baby, not only in terms of just having an appropriate weight, but also with the body composition. So first 1,000 days have been more crucial because adequate proteins. How many of us really talk in terms of compartmentalization of the diet that we take? Are we ever trying to look into aspects such as based on my body, am I having enough proteins? The requirement is laid there that for first trimester of pregnancy, you should have 1.5 grams of your body body weight. How many of them do take it? The second trimester and third trimester also there are set information, but people really don't follow it. They're just moving ahead with a holistic number of weight gain. So in my books, if all these nutrients are taken into account, of course, it will help in the muscle formation. It will help in the body structure and the growth of the infant. there is a lot of array and avenues for us to now take one step forward to look at the correlation of these into ultrasound, what you see during pregnancy. So that would also help us understanding the femur length, whether it has been appropriate. So it also can give us leads into how you can modulate your during pregnancy, which can help in ensuring that the good nutrition is given if you want to have your baby child as an athlete or any sports person.
Okay. But in your practice, Dr. Pratibha, I just want to know, were you able to measure how much of milk intake was there by an infant?
A very good question. Thank you so much, Dr. Sandhya.
Because this is a very difficult question. When we are, I will just, share a little background about why I asked this question to you. Because when we go on rounds, we see even, those children who are just born, the neonates, and we do the assessment, but we just write it as direct breastfeed or Palada feeds, because we don't know how much the baby has had. Despite the mother feeding the baby every second hourly, or whenever the baby is crying for feeds, the mother is feeding, but still we are not, we don't know how much of it the baby has consumed. The kind of talk that you have presented today has given us a lot of insight about how we can measure. So if at all you can share this, in your experience, if you have come across, it will be really great.
So first and foremost, thank you. This is a very valid question that you have raised, because what we have observed, and this is, I think, in general practice, that there are a lot of myths. Even today, women don't want to breastfeed their child for various reasons, maybe cultural, maybe their personal reasons, and many more. So if you want to look at exclusive breastfeeding, I'll answer this question in two parts. One is exclusive breastfeeding. People take for a month or two until they resume their work and they start the baby weaning food. So that is where the information on what is to be given and what not has been on a diluted method. Number two, even though mothers are breastfeeding, there's always a concern that my baby feeds only for 2 minutes and goes off to sleep. So how do I ensure that enough feeding is happening and how much the baby is being consuming the milk? Because after all, breastfeeding is a reflex action. The more the baby is put to breast, the more secretion would happen due to hormonal changes. Yeah. So here the concern is that while you have 3 methods which are not really robust, the best method, if your child is not gaining weight, as per the growth chart, it mandates for us to have one step ahead to intervene in terms of understanding whether the baby has some other morbidity. And this is where we come to picture using of stable isotopes. There's another major problem that people have not looked at is the gut microbiota. So we have seen that our children have frequent diarrhea, loose motions, and other kind of morbidity that is more related to wash thing. And when do you see this? Just in the children who are between 6 months to 2 years of age. That is the period when they're crawling or they're walking and things like that. And that is where the concern comes in, is that is nutrition given? Is breast milk fed? Is enough for this baby to catch up growth if it has been a low birth weight, or is it at least adequate for it to maintain its level in the growth chart? So while you ask me this question, you're on rounds and you see that the mother is not comfortable, we would also look at that as part of the growth of a baby. After birth, by 2nd or 3rd day, the baby is tending to lose some weight. By the day 10, it starts picking up. And it comes with a whole lot of pediatric and physiological changes that it happens. But as rightly said, if there is a concern whether the baby is getting enough breast milk, there are methods to look at it. The crude method is to look at the number of frequencies and time, just to get an estimate. Measuring baby periodically, understand whether the breastfeeding was done, and finally, if there's still a problem, we can do with isotope method, and that is dosing the mother and trying to understand every bit of the fluid that the baby is getting, either from breast milk or from outside milk or weaning, can be accounted for.
Thank you. Let's move on to the next question. Does correct weaning technique have any effect in adulthood?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Because we did a survey of understanding what were the dietary patterns of these school-going children. And it is observed that the healthy food intake has reduced robust. So the intake of fruits, vegetables, milk, meat products has gone down tremendously. What you see is all the junk food or snacking in between has started. So the weaning period is so important that it also starts changing a taste buds, acquiring to the taste and to the requirement. So what is important at this point of time, the weaning is done appropriately with the required nutrients, taking into account the requirements for that particular age, then the adulthood will be much more easier. I would not say adulthood, I would say immediate childhood. Oh. There are a couple of information studies done that appropriate weaning and decrease in morbidity rates.
Okay. Okay. Our next question is, how can we manage an obese pregnant woman? Should we focus on weight loss in women during pregnancy? In this women during pregnancy? A difficult question.
I was looking forward for this kind of a question that would be a little controversial, because in the era of people trying to maintain and not put on weight, being pregnant with gestational weight gain, it is a very genuine question that women tend to do it. Well, the whole concept over here is eating is right. So what weight gain you put in? If you were to remember my couple of slides ahead, I showed you a distribution of weight gain across the requirement for fetus, for soft tissues, for blood volume increment and things like that. So I would suggest that with a moderate physical activity, with a well-balanced diet, and a little bit of some exercises, you can still have your pregnancy with an adequate weight gain. So when you look at two women with a low BMI versus obese BMI mother, the weight gain varies. The weight gain for the obese mother is always less as compared to the one who has low BMI. The concept here is this: try to ensure that you get adequate nutrients, try to ensure that you complete your pregnancy with enough physical activity, enough sleep, which nobody talks about of late. Important to ensure that you have your pregnancy in the right direction and you have your delivery, which you have a lot of things as postpartum diet that can be catered to.
So the next question is, what are the do's and don'ts to be followed by diabetic pregnant women?
Well, the diabetic pregnant mother, there are again several norms. It starts from her history onwards. It starts whether it's a transient GDM, gestational diabetes mellitus, only for that woman. So the chances of these women going back to their normal sugar levels is 50%. So the trend currently for them is to restrict their diet to ensure that they don't have, there's a proportionate of your carbs, proteins, fats. There is an additional parameter of physical activity involved in this and some walking required. Unless the mother is on insulin therapy, the norm would be otherwise as a normal pregnant mother. Of course, there are a couple of restrictions that people tend to do just in case that they don't, because you know that there's a trend of having an increased weight in pregnancy, which may lead to a macrosomic baby. So that is what the people would try to constrain or because then it have other combinations of problems of having cesarean sections and many more. So diabetes itself is a morbidity during pregnancy. There are a couple of nutrients that are linked directly to this. A couple of food groups, they are also involved in this. So I think there is a whole platform to address to this concept.
Yeah, there's another question. Could you please explain nutritional requirements for twin pregnancy?
So, just to break this up, when earlier days people used to say you're pregnant, eat for 2. So when you have twins, are you saying eat for 3? No. So that concept doesn't really hold true. So generally, when there are twin pregnancies, there are levels where they don't tend to achieve the growth when you have a singleton baby. Which means that if you were to have one baby, you may have her weight or his weight up to 3 kilos or 3+ kilograms, right, at birth. But
Yeah.
that is not possible because you're trying to distribute the energy or you're trying to distribute the nutrients into equal proportion. You're trying to understand the space and the other transplacental information also into 2 halves. It could be, it may not be equally distributed, but on an average, it is how the compartmentalization takes place. So the only way forward over here is to have a balanced diet. So we could not say that if you have a twin baby, have 2,500 kilocalories, 2,120 kilocalories. Since you have twins, go for 3,000. No, that concept would not occur.
Okay. Okay, then the next question is how to manage the nutrient requirements of an anorexic mother. Anorexic mother.
Yeah, so this is very targeted population.
Yes.
So yeah, so this comes with a little bit of history. We will need to modulate her not at one time, but observe a period of times, because anorexia by itself has a different mode of treatment. So it cannot be given on a common platform. At least we can divide our morbidity, like pregnancy induced hypertension, you do XYZ and you may be able to curtail to the problems. Gestational diabetes, you can do A, B, C, and you can still manage your, but anorexia plays a very different role.
Yeah, we have to figure out why there is anorexia first.
Exactly. So it comes with the whole history.
Yeah.
There are other factors that play a major role in this.
Yeah. What is the reason we have to figure out, and then we have to rule out the multiple issues that are associated with anorexia, and then we can intervene.
Now, believe me, there are women who come up with this kind of a problem, and most of the time the relatives or the family members ignore it. They don't really think it is a major problem, but nevertheless, it does affect the growth of the baby.
Yeah, because ultimately whatever nutrition mother takes, that only is the source for the fetus to grow.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Fine. And the next question is, if a mother insists on losing weight post-pregnancy, how fast she can start a weight loss program?
Again, there are 2 things. It depends upon the type of delivery that the woman has undergone. Because for a cesarean section, you would not ask a woman to do a heavy lifting or any kind of, While in terms of normal delivery, they do allow your body to come back to the normalcy in 3 months. So you know that postpartum, you have water retention. And for it to come back to a pre-pregnancy state, at least 2 months is enough. You need to give that leverage for the mother to get back to the pre-pregnancy state. However, because of a lot of cultural and traditional practices, the eating habits, the patterns are quite different, and it is diversified with regards to custom and culture. So I could not put my finger on and say that you eat XYZ because more than the doctors, the family members rule the area of what a pregnant lactating mother should eat.
Yes.
So that is where it comes in. Now coming to the exercise per se, people do say that not to have heavy exercise postpartum within 6 months, only because the high physical activity may affect the lactation performance.
Okay. All right. So the next question is, what diet changes should be done when fetal weight is low in the third trimester? Probably, when there is IUGR diagnosed in the ultrasound, what are the measures that are taken?
Yeah, so there are actually guidelines given. Two aspects to look at. One is called small for gestational age, and one is called IUGR, intrauterine growth. And this is during an ultrasound. If you do a Doppler scan, you get to know whether your baby is only small for gestation, which means that it's proportionately small or disproportionately small. However, when it's an IUGR baby, it gives you many more complications, which indicates that the blood flow to the arterial flow of blood from the mother to the baby is restricted. So at this point of time, the complication could be not only the placental level, when the placenta may detach. It could be because the low-lying placenta that the mother is not able to give enough, and that is why the baby is IUGR. It could be that in general, the transfer of enough nutrients is not done. So it cannot be spoken as this is an IUGR baby, I'll give XYZ and things will be called. No. There are other things that have to be done clinically, particularly. And when you say IUGR baby, there would be some kind of morbidity, maybe preeclampsia, pregnancy-induced hypertension, which is a driver for IUGR.
Okay.
However, if you have small for gestational baby, which means that you are 32 weeks, but you see the growth of a baby which is a little lower, maybe at 28 or 30 weeks baby, then of course you can do some diet alterations. But the concept again over here is that the placenta is the person who is allowing the food to transfer to the baby. So the event of all this has to be really tackled when the placenta is being formed, the first trimester when the organogenesis is being formed, and hence you can then ensure that other things can be taken into care. But if I were to tell now in the third trimester, my placenta is not really doing well, I want to alter my diet, that would not be really of it.
Okay, so are there any supplements available that will help the baby's weight to get better in the last trimester?
Yeah, so third trimester time when the brain is developing, right? So there are mothers who take flax seeds, DHA, and many more kind of PUFAs rich, so that they all want Vishwanath Anand or brainy baby. So yeah.
Yes.
And you would see that Motherholic is 2 times the RDA. I'm sorry, I'm not talking about any particular company. I'm just trying to tell you that there are nutritional supplements which would give this insight to the mom to ensure that, okay, in third term, my baby's brain is growing. If I were to take some nutrient excess may help. But eventually, that's not the story. The placenta is one kind of a mediator, the door that allows enough nutrient to pass the other way.
Okay. So the next question is, this is something on in precious pregnancies, physical activity is restricted. Should diet become more strict then?
It just depends, because what happens is that when you talk about precious pregnancy, there are multiple things: IVI, IVF, surrogacy. So, is the reason that your uterus is not capable enough to hold or sustain until 40 weeks of gestation. Number 2 is that how is your placenta? If it is a low-lying placenta, then by no way the doctor will allow you to do physical activity. Otherwise, the placenta will be delivered first and your baby is not going to be able to make it. So there are other norms. So when you talk about precious pregnancy, it all depends upon what are the reasons for this. It could be that the uterus is not strong enough and it let goes multiple times as abortion. You would have seen people who come in 2 or 3 abortions, and then the next one, it's a precious baby, they want to retain this baby well. There's something called uncirclage that we do, that is tying of the os, the mouth of the uterus, so that you allow that strain for the mom to take through the 9 months, and then you open it just before the delivery. So yes, precious pregnancies are dealt with care. They are dealt with very customized, tailor-made nutrition at times, and even the physical activity is monitored very well. The only reason we do this, that there are other factors, maybe genetic or any non-modifiable factors that play a more hand onto this circumstances.
Okay. So the next question is, what diet changes should be done when fetal weight is, yeah, sorry, this I was just repeating. Another question is, ma'am, is it obvious that diabetic women also get hypertension? What is the nutritional management for that pregnant women?
I would say, to some extent, it is a myth that every hypertensive mom may not be a diabetic or vice versa. The reason why people tend to link it up is only this. Diabetes or hypertension is seen second half of the pregnancy after 20 weeks of gestation. Let me talk about these two things in independence. The pregnancy hypertension or preeclampsia generally is seen after 20 weeks when the placenta is all formed. There's an insert or perforation of the intravilli is not done well, and the connect between the placenta and the mother is not well established, and that is where you get to see all these kind of connections. While in gestational diabetes, it again is rooted to the placenta, and that is why people have a myth saying that the one who is hypertensive may have higher chance of having diabetes, may not be true in all circumstances. It's only because the mediator over here is the same organ.
Okay. So do you want to, advise them to restrict salt in the diet?
Wow.
As a general recommendation?
So this was one of the questions that kept coming in for all the OB-GYNs and things like that. Right? Unlike pregnancy, we do talk about, oh, you're hypertensive, please restrict salt.
Salt.
So salt or sodium actually has no relationship with hypertension. It will not avoid hypertension. However, when you have an hypertension, the sodium content may involve in creating oxidative stress markers, and that is how the complications get. But the statement of saying restrict your salt to avoid hypertension during pregnancy is not good.
Okay. The next question is, can a pregnant lady take multivitamin tablets? Which trimester can they start that with?
So, in previous pregnancy, there are women who plan pregnancy, right? So they start their IFF pills, they start multivitamins, they start omegas and many other things well before they plan pregnancy.
Yes.
So there isn't a particular frame, I would say. I would rather say more than tablets, eat healthy food. That will do everything. A balanced diet would certainly replace your medication. But if you want to try multivitamins, I would not recommend on any particular trimester, because people want to have DH in the third trimester thinking that the brain development is done. They may talk about a couple of multivitamins, which has most of collagen binding protein and things like that, because the second trimester lean body mass is growing. So it just depends upon, but there are doctors who would like their patients to have multivitamins. But,
yeah.
On an average, I would, if I were to recommend, I would say healthy, balanced diet.
Okay. Thank you so much. Yeah. Like, another question that I wanted to ask you was, is there any requirement that women have to continue folic acid throughout their pregnancy? Folic acid supplementation?
Absolutely. But nobody is following the guidelines. If you were to look at the guidelines, the first trimester requirement of folic acid is very, very high. That is why you have 5 mg of folic acid given the first trimester. And that is based on the evidences that folic acid helps in avoiding neural tube defects. There are all the anomalies that can be avoided when organogenesis is taking place, when a spinal cord is being formed, and that is why folic acid was planned for. As you continue pregnancy, you need not have 5 mg of folic acid. So if you were to take any combination of iron and folic acid, it would be only 0.5 mg from the second trimester until delivery. That is supportive to the existing regimen. However, now, because of the concept of folic trap, people have also said that it would be ideal to start folic acid before pregnancy, continue till first pregnancy, and try to taper down, so that if you are deficit with vitamin B12 or B6, you do not have this folic acid being trapped at the methionine cycle level, which is called methyl folic trap, and you would be able to utilize it to the best.
Dr. Pratibha, I just wanted to ask you one thing. Like in your presentation, you've covered that, if a mother is vitamin B12 deficient, then definitely the baby will have vitamin B12 deficiency and things.
Well, so I was talking about 2 levels. One from the observational study that we have seen, indicating there's a transfer of nutrient to the baby. That was a concept here. So when we looked at the dietary pattern and identified B12 levels relating to the maternal status, that is in blood, the B12 biomarker, indicating that there's no other source of B12 than the diet. When you had low vitamin B12 in status, that is in your blood, these mothers had higher risk of having IUGR, not that they would definitely have. So they had different levels, odds of having IUGR.
Okay.
And that could be aggravated. So I think it's an independent association, but that association also standing true when you look at from a food group point of view. Now, what are the sources of B12? The animal products. So the question comes is that what happens to these women who are vegetarian, who follow vegetarian? So we were at our labs also trying to test the tap water. The tap water was also containing B12, indicating that there is fecal contamination as well. So there are a lot of issues towards B12 because it is a water soluble and it gets washed off. People really haven't put their too much of attention into it, and that is why it is not still a mandate routine ANC, part of ANC. It's only iron, folic acid, and calcium so far. But other set of scientists want to incorporate that as part of the routine care.
Okay. But do you have any women who are really falling in the underweight category, but they did have normal, infants, in the sense with an infant born with a normal birth weight, without having any complications?
Yeah, so that is what we saw here, that diet during pregnancy plays a very, very important role. So we had these set of women who started a pregnancy with low BMI. So they weighed less than 45 kilos when they were pregnant, and they were not more than 5 feet 2 inch. So to tell you that the BMI would be far less, like 16 kg per meter square or something like that. And there were a bunch of women who had their BMI of 30, which meant that they were overweight and obese category leading.
Okay.
And try to understand without any intervention how their dietary patterns work and what led to their birth outcomes. And again, all this was done through scientific study to understand that only to focus on if there were adequate nutrients during pregnancy, enough diet during pregnancy, would they still give rise to a normal birth in baby? So that is the message that is possible, and that is why these pregnancy days are crucial.
All right. There are, 2 more questions. If you, permit, I will be taking those questions. Is that fine?
Sure.
Yeah. So how much weight gain should a pregnant woman get during her pregnancy? What is the normal range that you recommend?
So the weight gain is is well established now. So we have guidelines by ICMR NIN that have been documented. It also depends upon the rural and urban component because of the physical activity taken into account. For a woman who is low BMI or is underweight can put on weight from 10 to 12 kilos comfortably. Those who are excess in weight or they're overweight, they generally tend to put on 6 to 8 kilos of weight. But there are women who have put on a lot of weights, going up to 16 kilos in either ways. Then the concern is that the other parameters are way in excess.
Yeah.
And I think somebody talk about depends upon her pre-pregnancy BMI. So this is all we want to tell you that basically depends upon where you are, whether you're a normal BMI person or an obese person or you're a low BMI person. If you're low BMI, you have a larger spectrum to put on weight as compared to those who are not.
Yeah.
And based on that, there are a couple of set guidelines which talks about protein requirement, energy consumption, and physical activity as well.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Dr. Pratibha. Very patiently, you've taken, a lot of questions and you have, clarified all our doubts. This tells us about the robust practice that you have.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. It was a very, informative session. We are getting a lot of feedbacks also on our WhatsApp group about this. And I have an announcement about the quiz that we have. I would request my colleague Anisha to just give the participants the guidelines about the quiz.
Good afternoon, everyone. So the guidelines are as follows. A Google form will be shared to all the participants. This is on the chat group. It will consist of 10 questions from Dr. Pratibha's talk. This form will accept responses for a duration of 20 minutes from the start of the sharing of the form. It will be evaluated and the answers will be evaluated by the IDABC, and the names of the winners will be shared on email. So now apparently the latest questions are more than 10, but I'm sure 20 minutes will still be enough for answering those questions.
Sure. So we've already shared the link in the chat box. So it will be open for 20 minutes, and post that, we will stop accepting the responses. We will evaluate, and then, we will email the names of the winners and the correct answers also. Now, may I request Daphne ma'am to present the vote of thanks?
Yeah. Good evening, I'm Daphne. And usually a vote is given, through a ballot or a show of hands. So I think this aptly calls for a show of hands. Can we have some thumbs up on the screen, or can we all just, show, yeah,
Yes.
those signs of, come on girls, we want more thumbs up there. Okay, thank you, Shubha. Okay, but firstly, let me give a big shout out to the Bangalore LEC, headed by Dr. Sandhya and the team, that it was a very good initiative and I think an apt topic, because we were so connected, everybody was so involved, and it was very interesting. So thank you, LEC and Sandhya. It was an excellent effort. Dr. Pratibha, I think every question had a thanks in itself. We thank you for this wonderful session. It was, yeah, like everybody is saying, it was informative. It helped to clear a lot of gray areas, some things were very point blank told to us. And of course, some things were just so typical of your practice. Isotopes and body composition, literally, we had to grasp and rethink the things, but it was very informative again. Thank you, Dr. Pratibha, again, for just accepting our invitation and being with us. Thank you, technical team. Now, Sorry, you were saying something.
Yeah, thank you very much. And I just wanted to bring it up saying that we all are still following the same school of thoughts and we're taking a progeny ahead. There's a lot more to explore, there's a lot more to understand. And I think every step matters a lot in the ocean of knowledge.
Yes.
Yeah, thank you so much, Dr. Pratibha. The technical part that you have covered about the stable isotopes and the potassium.
Yes, that was good. Yeah.
It is really very good. It is actually giving us a lot of information that we have to go back and read so that we
Exactly.
will know, how it is done and things. And
Yeah.
we will need, a lot of insight from your side also. We might come back to you asking for some, technical sessions. And thank you so much for a very, very informative talk.
Thank you to our technical team also. We are not technical. It was our own dietitians who did so much behind.
Yes.
Who did so much behind, and this link of this questionnaire and all this. Thank you so much, team. It went so smoothly.
Yeah.
And like Sandhya was saying, Dr. Pratibha, this it was interesting to note body composition studies that you have done and intelligence. I've just written down 2 or 3 things that I wanted to mention. The intelligence scope related.
Yes. So may I request the participants to switch on their camera? Let us take some pictures. Dr. Pratibha, please stay back. We'll take some pictures and then we can discuss.
Thank you all once again.
May I request all of them to switch on their camera, please? Yeah, there are many of them switching it on right now. Yeah, thank you. And may I request the participants to stay back on the platform for some more time? And then, after we stop accepting the responses, you can disperse. Another 10 minutes. Dr. Pratibha will be sharing the questions also with you. So while we were listening, we were making the questions, and then we have prepared the Google form. We'll share the questions with you.
Thank you so much. Amazing that you could get 10 long questions. Lovely.
Yeah, while we were listening, we started making the questions. Dr. Pratibha, if you want to leave the platform, it's absolutely fine. We are just, holding on the participants just to ensure that we'll keep up the time limit for the quiz.
Sure. So I thank everyone. I hope I don't miss thanking those who are behind the scenes on the IDEA platform for giving this opportunity to talk in this important session of Nutrition Month. And stay safe, stay healthy. Thank you.
Thank you so much.